Michelle.
Daniel.
OG Rose.
And today we're going to be talking about a paper called On Typography, featured in Reconstructing A is A. And the paper has a lot to do with Derrida. The title is a response to On Grammatology by Derrida, where he really wants to explore the history of philosophy, mainly metaphysics, with the history of writing, the difference between philosophy when it was done orally, say Socrates, or so I think like Aristotle, we mostly have his notes from his students. You had this history of philosophers that didn't write so much, they just spoke, and then philosophy moved into the direction of being more written. And there's some ironies that Derrida wants to explore, how philosophers will talk about the impossibility of the written word to capture what they want to say, and then would tell you to go read their book. The impossibility. So there was this kind of irony that was lurking. And Derrida wants to critique the entire possibility of text ever capturing meaning fully, of it ever doing that. But then he wants to capture the possibility of language doing that. In any kind of word. He's going to talk about how, if you try to define a word, what do you have to do it with? Words. And words, the definition, each word has its own definition, so you get this endless chain of difference. And that's always funny, too, because the word difference is spelled as difference. You can only tell the difference between difference and difference if you speak it. So there's a disconnect there. But a way to sum it up is, no matter what you're dealing with, language is always going to struggle to capture its meaning, and it never fully captures its meaning. And he wants to critique the possibility of any language fully capturing meaning. And for Derrida, this maps on very well to the history of metaphysics, and generally philosophy at all. Now, today we have these stark lines between, say, analytical philosophy, metaphysical philosophy, theology, ontology, all these different things. But for most of history, philosophy, they're all just very blurred together. Those kind of distinctions are pretty modern. And you'll have questions like in philosophy, like, what is justice? What is the good? What is the meaning of life? Another way to look at what Derrida does is any is questions, what a thing is, are deconstructed. It's not possible. It's not possible to say what is justice in a sort of objective, absolute way. You can only continue the conversation, per se. You can only keep trying to fill or trying to find it, but you can never know with certainty. If you do find it, you just have to go with the flow. Now, Derrida viewed his project as being good for justice, because he viewed, if somebody can say what is justice, then they can, establish justice as X, and anyone who thinks it's Y is oppressed. Derrida, in that book by Dr. James K. Smith on Derrida, Derrida at a conference at some point made a real point to say that deconstruction is justice, that what he was doing was all about justice. And is statements, which sounds like essentialism in Foucault, can certainly be used to oppress. And so Derrida was kind of in the business of deconstructing these is statements for the sake of increasing freedom, creativity, and possibility. But there's a difference, as the paper is going to explore, between, say, deconstructing the metaphysics of isness, or what I'll call the book, or what's called the book, the metaphysics of the book in the paper, and the metaphysics of apprehension, or reading, or the grasping of a thing as itself.
Yeah, no, I think that that's all really good, Daniel, and I think that like the paper discusses, there is an aspect of Derrida's project which was successful.
Oh, yeah.
In the grammatology, it's like if you just look at all of the words and you think about the distance between the signifier and the signified, right?
Right.
But there's yet more to sort of poke at with that, and I think that's why going to the typography is very interesting. And I know that you've had great discussions with Thomas Jockin on typography.
Absolutely.
And that was definitely formative for
absolutely.
These ideas, and I think that there's just something really, really quite fascinating about just the fact that we can even suddenly look at a set of letters, right?
Right.
And we just, like you said, apprehend, or we read a certain word.
That's correct.
And even meaning.
Well, so Derrida's big critique can kind of be said that you can never cross the divide between the signifier and the signified. So, for example, the word cat signifies the phenomenon of cat. And Derrida basically wants to say you can never actually objectively establish that the word cat has something to do with the phenomenon of cat. And it sounds kind of silly as a silly point, like, well, duh, the word cat is not the same as the phenomenon of cat. But it actually has profound implications because for all of philosophy, because likewise you can never close the gap between, say, lowercase j justice and uppercase j justice. You can never close your ideas of what constitutes freedom with what actually, like, some objective absolute freedom. You're always there's always a level of uncertainty between the signifier, the word, and the thing. So there's this gap that you can never cross. And so what Derrida wants to do is basically any metaphysics or philosophy or thinking in general of which purports itself as closing the gap, as crossing the gap, is done with. It's not possible. You can't do it. And so any philosophy that proposes itself as accomplishing that is deconstructed. However, as you're getting at, even if you deconstruct the possibility of, say, aligning the cat with the Platonic cat, the cat you experience with the Platonic cat, there's still a act that happens before that is very mysterious and very important, which is the apprehension of the cat itself. You apprehend that that's a cat. Well, how in the world do you do that? Where do you locate catness? You just look at a cat and say, that's a cat. And even if there then, with that act of apprehension, opens a gap between the phenomenon of the cat you're experiencing and the ideal cat or the absolute cat or something like that, even if you can't cross that gap, you still have the act of reading, of apprehension that you have to explain, that you have to understand, and you see that's the difference, as the paper will talk about, between the metaphysics of Plato. The paper is going to talk about Platonism and Platonists, because I've been convinced that Plato's metaphysics is more interesting than, say, the ideal Platonism that you hear talked about, or perfect forms or different things. I think I've been convinced, and hopefully the paper on geometry, geometry, astronomy, and Platonic forms as ordering principles helps clarify that. But I still think it's fair to say that Platonists and Platonism can be critiqued in the way that Derrida is talking about. So anyway, the paper is going to describe the difference between Platonism and Aristotle, the Aristotelian metaphysics and Platonic metaphysics, because I think Aristotelian metaphysics are metaphysics of apprehension or reading.
Right, and that point is interesting because it sort of is really emphasizing how Derrida, in a sense, addresses or deconstructs, if you will, this Platonic, again, this is kind of the
popular understanding.
Yeah, the popular understanding of
which
Plato.
had a huge influence. So, I mean, Derrida
Right.
deconstructing it is valid.
Right, deconstructing this
Platonism, Platonist.
Right, exactly. Not the nuanced
Plato,
reading of
yeah.
Plato, which is probably more accurate, but
Yeah.
like the one that is most widely promoted
Yes,
and
yes.
ascribed to and kind of
Yes.
probably taught in history of philosophy.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Segments of history classes which you had in high school or something.
Yes.
like that.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's like this idea. I think that idea of the Aristotelian metaphysics is very interesting, and I think the fact that like the paper gets into with Aristotle's terms of substance, form, essence,
Mm-hmm.
there's a balance of those things, right? There's a it's kind of like the idea that the word cat and the meaning of it, or what you're thinking in your head, are kind of in a sense like one, but they're not, right? 'Cause it's not like the ink on the page is the same as like what the cat means, the word cat means. So there's something that's very much, I think, more in line with like perception and thinking about Aristotelian thought.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that in this dimension, this type of metaphysics, therefore, is not exactly, this is not deconstructed by what Derrida's project did. And I think that's very interesting and very important because like I said, I think there's just something that feels more in line with our faculties, really, about the Aristotelian metaphysics, which cannot be overlooked. And the fact that it was not deconstructed by Derrida's project, I think, is very telling about, I almost want to say like the power or the force or the magnitude, maybe magnitude's a good word, of metaphysics itself.
Well, you can't escape it. I mean, the word metaphysics, as we'll talk about in Reconstructing, is you have to think of metaphysics as the ability of physics to refer to physics, and how strangely mysterious that is. Like, we are in human, we're bodies, we are in bodies, we exist in a space. Sometimes we're in clown costumes. That's the reward for people who listen to our songs. That's a reward reference. Good job, people.
That's our inside
It's like when you're
joke
reading like Finnegan's Wake, and you're like, oh, I get that one. I know that language.
Sorry,
it's good.
So,
it's good.
Yeah.
We have to reward viewers that come back. They have to feel like they get reward. So like physics, like when you think of metaphysics as referring, meta means like self-referential, the ability to refer. So metaphysics is the mysterious ability of physics to refer to physics, which is very strange, because how does physics refer to physics? It is physics. It's participating in physics, but it's like a camera that's able to turn and look at itself, or bend the lens toward itself, and it looks at itself. It's very, very strange. Usually when you have a closed system, the closed system or the vector or whatever cannot incorporate thoughts about itself. But humans, which if you look at yourself, you see physics. You look at your hand and you see physics. And yet you look at your hand and you think that's a hand. There's an ability to refer to the physical object of hand as idea hand. So this is very strange. Where does the idea come from? Now, of course, you can say that, the thought comes from a neuron of your hand. But, if you were to look at the neuron in your head, it would not literally be the experience of your hand. There's a distinction between the neuron and the idea of which maybe the neuron makes possible. The issue is that if physics causes metaphysics, that does not mean metaphysics can be reduced to physics. It's kind of this weird thing where if metaphysics is an emergence, something that is possible because of physics, it does not follow that metaphysics can then just be said, oh, it's just physics. No more than you can say Beethoven's Ninth is just the instrument, so it's just the notes on the sheet of paper. That's something that's, I think, really important. Causation, it is not the case that if something causes something, that what is caused is therefore reducible to what caused it. It can gain properties, it can gain dimensions of which are not found from the prior vector, to use that language from Mr. Alexander Ilang, that Bard will work with him on that. So metaphysics, this crazy ability that humans have to refer to physical objects, that's what Aristotle is very concerned about. The act of reference itself, which is like when you like right over there is a notepad, you say, that notepad. Well, that's where form, essence, and substance come together very mysteriously, just like that. And it's tricky, as essence, substance, and form, like they're kind of interchangeable, but they're not interchangeable. They're always kind of like the moment an object is meaningful, all three come together in an indivisible manner, which makes it seem that they're equivalent. But there's the idea, the generality, and the particularity that come together and make you go, bam, that notepad. And again, the mystery of this, and this is reference. This is metaphysics as reference, not metaphysics as what is a notepad. Notice how Plato's Platonic metaphysics is to ask, what is the notepad? But that's not how it works. You actually know that's a notepad first, and then ask, what is it? The isness comes after the apprehension. But so you have to, the paper also, Reconstructing it will talk about the thatness. Like this moment where, oh, that. And you know what that is. And then you say, well, how do I know what that is? Well, but that second act, deconstructing that second act of asking what is a notepad, does not deconstruct the initial apprehension. And that is where you can develop an entire metaphysical system of thought and philosophy based on. That we'll get into more conditionalism, aesthetic philosophy, beauty, all of these topics that we've touched on.
Yeah, no, that's all really good, Daniel. Well, two things came to mind as you were talking. I was kind of thinking about it's like, go ahead, like look at your neuron. I'm sorry, that's kind of gruesome.
It'd be difficult. Yeah.
Well, it's just kind of like funny because it's just interesting how, I've never really thought about it, but I'm not trying to dismiss, I love biology, I love science and stuff like that, but it's just like, it's fascinating how we just sort of use this standard of like, somebody can observe some sort of causality or whatever, yes, and saying like, well, that's where it came from.
Yes.
And the other thing of saying that is that it's inside of your body. You can look at your hand, right? and it's kind of interesting because it's like there's a space around your hand, there's your hand, and then there's whatever's inside your hand, which you really can't see.
Yes.
So there's this very interesting kind of, I want to say almost like this, I don't know, trifecta of experience or something like that. And I think that's like reflected too in Aristotle's, form, substance, essence.
Yes.
And I think also, so that was the first thing that came to mind, kind of a random aside. It also reminded me of like one of my favorite scenes from a book I like.
Yes.
And then then I was also thinking about just that idea of like the, a lot of the questions are posed in the with the Platonic metaphysics, if we want to call it that, the metaphysics of isness, right?
Yes.
Or something. It's like that. What's interesting about that is that's where a lot of the questions of like is, this idea of like, well, what is life? Is life real? Are we alive? Are we in a simulation?
Yeah.
All of that strikes me as like the Platonic metaphysic, the isness metaphysics. Yes. And it's funny though, because we don't even, like you're saying, what's so simple yet so profound is the fact that, you did just sort of like interpret it as life though.
Yes, that's exactly right.
It's like you still interpreted this as life.
Yes.
And now you're trying to say, like, is this life a simulation?
Yes, but you've already presupposed life.
Exactly.
It's quite critical because...
It's huge.
Because it means that meaning comes before the thought.
Exactly.
And so, I would strongly argue that if you take seriously the metaphysics of Aristotle, it's a massive... that will greatly fight the meaning crisis. Because the meaning crisis, you get the meaning crisis of Vervaeke, we talk about, from one, either a nihilistic deconstruction, where it's like, oh, there's no truth, beauty, or whatever, because we can't establish isness. So then you get hopelessness. But you can also get a meaning crisis because you're looking for meaning in isness. Like you say, well, Derrida's wrong. We can find a metaphysics of isness, and then you find out Derrida was right about that. So you get stuck in that, and you're in trouble. Because you basically go, oh, well, if we can't establish isness, then we can't have meaning. If you're falling into that trap, therefore life can't have meaning, and you're done. But wait, what did you do? You just said life can't have meaning. There is meaning in that sentence. Life has meaning to you. You can't talk about life not having meaning unless there's meaning, unless that's a meaningful phrase, of which is based not on definition but apprehension. You see, what if you think you can only have meaning if you can only have definition, like explicitly state what is the meaning of life, explicitly state what is the meaning of your life, well, then you can fall into what Derrida deconstruct and be hopeless. But if instead you go, wait, no, meaning is found in apprehension. Meaning is found in a certain conditionality and towardness to life that then I can try to explain like a poem, which is always just an approximation. Whatever the answer to the question of what is the meaning of life has to be a poem. It can never just be a collection of phrases or premises that are put together. That's what Derrida is right about, that you can never have an exact correlation, of premises, because it's always going to defer. But you can certainly write a poem that is pointing toward a real apprehension and experience. The fact that you have to write a poem, you say, oh, it's a poem, so, you're just making up the fact that there's meaning, because if there was real meaning, you would, be able to say it clearly. No. I can never put that painting right there fully into words. That painting will always exceed my ability to put it into words. Does that mean the painting's not there? No, that means the painting is more there than what words can articulate. It's more there than what words can articulate. What Derrida makes clear is that from words you can't arise to that painting. Well, if we believe that's the only way to get meaning, then we go, well, it's hopeless now. We're done. But once we get that, no, you see the painting. You apprehend the paintings of life first and then put them into words. And the best you can do is poems. Well, then you can have meaning. Then life can have meaning. And so Aristotelian metaphysics are critical for overcoming the meaning crisis.
There's no painting here. Daniel's making it up completely.
Yeah, you can never cross the. Yeah, you can't cross Zeno's divide between this recording and the experience of what's going on. Exactly.
I'm kidding. There's
a gap.
Here.
It's an uncrossable gap. Miss Ford.
Our beautiful friend Christina made.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
All good stuff, Daniel. I think something that's very interesting is it makes me think of Merleau-Ponty's line, we're all condemned to meaning.
Absolutely.
And actually there is something very, you see, phenomenologist of perception, and there is something very much about this idea of the inherent meaning we derive from things and give things and ascribe to things, even in our attempt not to, or something like that, you know. And that's very linked to kind of a perception. There's like this kind of, there's something very interesting about perceiving that is a meaning that's like coming together, almost just very, very instantaneously.
Absolutely.
It's kind of miraculous, you know, how quickly that happens.
Oh, it's crazy.
Yeah,
I mean, if you really pay attention to your ability to apprehend, everything becomes like miraculous.
It is.
And mysterious in that Flannery O'Connor way, like that good mystery that makes everything have a... Well, and again, it's like we speak with Zaruba on religion and nothingness. Like, we very rarely do we actually look at anything, like really see it. And so much of the Eastern practices and praise of Shah, all these different things, it's about like really, really seeing. Like, basically, Aristotle's like, guys, isn't it crazy that you see things? Like, really seeing. Like, fighting the meaning crisis, so much of fighting the meaning crisis is seeing. And really taking seriously the extraordinary wonder of this instantaneous coming together of essence, substance, and form. Now, I should clarify, some Aristotelian scholars might say, oh, well, Aristotle breaks those categories down more into different things. That's fine. For our purposes, using those three is enough. You can, of course, get into to different details, and that's valuable. But the point is that radical ability to, boom, apprehend, that thing is there. And the reason why this is so mysterious is precisely because of things like the ship of Theseus, or are there holes or just parts? You know, if you start taking a ship apart, when does the ship vanish, right? That's kind of an old philosophy paradox. Like, if you start taking parts away of a thing, when does the whole go away? Well, you can't really answer these questions. There's a lot of these different philosophical paradoxes that you can't answer, precisely because of the problems of isness that Derrida is talking about. But they actually are answered in apprehension because they're emergent. Holes are emergences. You know, ships are emergences that you apprehend, and you do successfully, and they are accurate, and they are real, but they cannot be reduced to causality. All of those various philosophical paradoxes point to the fact that humans are ontologically, to some degree, emergent, not merely causal, that they have emergent capacities that cannot be reduced. But if you follow a philosophy of reductionism that believes that the truest form of things are what they are made out of, well, then you, by definition, are going to have to understand human beings as being an isness, of which does not entail any emergent properties or abilities, and of course you get the meaning crisis, because meaning is emergent, and if emergence is not allowed, there is no meaning, and therefore you have your meaning crisis.
Yeah, there's kind of a isolation, fragmentation feeling that I was getting when you were talking about
Absolutely.
You know, seeing things as they're like almost their most reduced parts or whatever.
That's right. And it's not like how you view the world. You don't, when you grasp that that's a notepad or that's a painting, you grab the whole, the thatness, and then think about the parts. You know, we do not phenomenologically exist in a manner that suggests that things are realist as their parts. The parts come second. The definitions of words come second. That's what's funny. Like, you read cat, and then if someone says, what's a cat? You go, a furry feline. Like, you literally have to stop and think to recall the definition. You do not immediately grasp definitions of terms. You grasp the wholes. Yeah. Like, boom. And then when someone's like, well, what's your definition of cat? Then you go, well, paws and tail, and you like struggle and fumble over the words. The very act of showing how we fumble over like our struggle to give definitions to terms that we successfully use, right there shows that apprehension is more consequent, is more primary than definition.
Yeah, and I mean, I was thinking about the idea of the emergence, and there was something like there was kind of a feeling coming forth where it was like just a growing plant, like the idea of the components of the soil, water, seed. You know, there's like all these components that come together, and it emerges from the ground, and it you know, it moves forth toward the light of the sun, you know, has its circadian rhythms and its blossom. I think there's just something very almost like in tandem with other things that create this emergence.
Absolutely.
And are kind of we rely on that in very profound and intricate, complex ways that then allow for us to be able to so miraculously and, you know, in such a rapacious way, like are able to apprehend so quickly.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I was thinking about the word too, just emergency. You know, it's kind of like it's something very, very quick.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, and there is something to be said about wanting to take seriously dialectically isness, because if you apprehend that's a cat, and then you go, well, was that a cat? And you look and it's actually a groundhog. You know, isness can have a corrective function, and likewise you can have a dialectic between apprehension and isness to check the apprehension. But the apprehension is just as real as the isness. The apprehension is a necessary component of the dialectic, and if you don't pay attention to the apprehension and just go straight to the isness, you have trouble. And a lot of times the isness can be deconstructed, just like Derrida said. Well, if you have apprehension, then if the isness is deconstructed, you fall back on the apprehension and you have something to hold you up, per se, some sort of dimension of meaning that's still constituted. But if you don't have the apprehension and the isness is deconstructed, you just fall into an endless void. And so you just fall into bad nihilism, and that is what has occurred. You have no wonder left. You know, if isness is gone, and isness was the source of your wonder and thinking, and now that's gone, well, you have nothing. You have no new ground for philosophy, no new ground for thinking, no new ground for wonder, and so you just fall. But if isness gets deconstructed, because sometimes and often it should be, for the ways that Derrida was correct about, even if it can have a good value within a dialectic, but you can still fall into and upon apprehension, then you have a ground for thinking. Then you have a ground for philosophy, you have a ground for aesthetics, you have a ground for meaning. And so you can overcome the meaning crisis. But without that, which unfortunately I don't think we tend to have or understand very much, well then yeah, you get a meaning crisis.
Yeah, and I think the reason why too it combats the meaning crisis to understand this ability, like that reading and apprehension, the metaphysics of reading has not been deconstructed. The reason why that combats the meaning crisis too is because I think there's something very personal about your own experience of the world.
Absolutely.
And I want to say that there's something about that is fuller in nature, because it has this, like we said, emergent quality or property to it, where there is a realization of like being a part of this emergence of the world itself. You know, I guess what I mean to say is like the becoming aspect. Right?
Yes,
we
yes,
move to the becoming from just simply focusing on isness and being.
Yes.
You know, or being and nothing or something like that, which is an important project. Don't get me wrong, but it's just the becoming is what I think can really. I don't mean to use that word so many times. Combat.
No.
Combat the meaning crisis, though, because it's that very becoming that is so essential for helping to overcome.
Yes.
The very stagnant but oppressive. It's almost like a, you know, well, let's just, if we think about a meaning crisis in experience, it's kind of like you feel like you're dead but you're still alive. There's it can be very weighty.
Yes.
You know, it's very like depression, anxiety, all of that, which is so difficult. But I think that's because you're still a living being. You're still a becoming, right? You actually are a becoming. Mm-hmm. You're more of a becoming than a being. Yes. And yet you almost like don this, I almost want to say like a type of
straitjacket.
Yeah, in a sense, or I keep on like envisioning just like literally having like this heavy stone, you know, because the thing is the dichotomy there is in a sense, I want to say like a stagnant.
Yes.
Well, how do I put this? It's to have that be like already deconstructed, and like there's something that kind of like, it's almost like, okay, here's this big giant stone, okay, mm-hmm. It's the Platonic form, and this is again the mainstream Platonic understanding. Now that Derrida said, well, look, we've deconstructed that with grammatology, it's almost like this stone kind of like falls back on you. It's just like
yeah,
and now like this stone is on you, and you're just like, well, what else is there to do? What else can we do now?
That's right.
And it's heavy, it's weighty, it's crushing, I mean, this is what I think happens in that kind of schema of understanding.
That's right.
And I think the hope of understanding the invincibility of the Aristotelian metaphysics is to understand that it is not a stone, actually.
Right.
Well, even if it is, there's almost like this way in which suddenly that burden becomes very light.
Sure.
Because it's almost like the formation is actually inside of yourself coming out.
Oh yeah, well that's a good way to put. I mean, there is as you switch.
That could be.
As you switch from Plato
bit,
to Aristotle, Platonic to Aristotle, you move from form to formulation. Like you're the apprehension and the conditionality of yourself. You become the form.
Well, that's the thing.
The
like
formulation.
You become the formulation. So maybe you have this kind of existential crisis of the stone on you. Okay,
sure.
I think that's a good thing in a sense because you almost are able to be more in touch with reality. Like.
Well, existential crisis is a necessary phase in the quote-unquote phenomenological journey of Hegel, to use from Dr. Laz. I mean, existential... Yes. If you never have existential dread, you don't ever come to terms with existence. Right.
But this is the thing. Stone falls on you, okay? Like,
Sure.
In this analogy, it's not going to hurt you to the point of death or something, those crazy cartoon situations, okay? Or maybe you are a cartoon. Now you can pop back up again. But anyways, here's the deal. That's okay. Get out from under the stone and leave it behind. You do not need to carry this thing. Like, this thing does not need to be in your hands anymore. Right. It's not.
Right.
Leave it behind. Keep walking. And I think there's something very freeing about that. And then you realize that, like, oh, no, it's not that form. That's not the thing I should be, like, seeing as the formulation of existence and reality. I am the reality.
You want to, like,
I am the becoming that is a part of forming the world itself.
There is an oppression that comes with who am I? There's an oppression with like having to maintain an identity in different things. Now it depends on what you mean by that, because there's another sense in which not thinking about who you are is very detrimental. But you see, thinking about who am I is good if it causes the existential dread of which makes you, in a sense, go through the Dante purgatory, by which you can come to terms with what you are. And what you ultimately are is a becoming. So if the question of who am I causes a positive deconstruction, per se, of the very question of who am I, and instead you ask, who am I becoming? What is my purpose? What am I toward? What is my orientation? That's quite good. And of course you have to explore all those terms and different things, but you see, when you think of yourself as primarily in terms of being, but a becoming apprehension, like you're always a tuning of an instrument. You are this kind of tuning of an instrument to be better at apprehending life, at apprehending world, and apprehending thing, of becoming, to use the language Javier has been using, that's very good, on receptibility. Receptivity. I don't know words, English, because I'm not bound to these gap creations. The Derrida. So you are constantly in the business of improving your receptibility to wonder, to awe, to thought. And that's what you are. And becoming better at that receptibility and improving in that. Your thinking changes. I used receptibility again, didn't I?
It's okay. I think, we can. That's a word. That can be a word.
Yeah. So you're thinking of yourself as that, as something that's able to receive because you're able to perceive. You start thinking of this deep connection between perception and reception. If we're using that language here, where you understand the better you are at perceiving and apprehending, the better you are at receiving life, as opposed to saying I need to know who I am to live the full life. Well, that's just a massive stone that can crush you. Instead, become someone who can receive life. Like, if you're trying to, like, find life in yourself, it's like, I gotta find the meaning of life, who am I so that I can live? Well, it depends on what you mean by that, but there's a real sense in which you can never give yourself that life, because it has to be apprehended externally and received anew every single day.
Yeah, I mean, and also, like, to that point, it's like, oh, wait a second, you actually already exist. So there's kind of like,
we're
talking about the inherent, like, we're saying, like, the condemned meaning, the kind of the idea of, oh my gosh, like, what is the book? Well, wait a second, I already, like, apprehended that was a book. I already read that was a book. Right. It's like that's the whole thing is like, to find this idea of, like, well, who am I, and what does it mean to, like, live a life, and that's kind of the stone mentality.
Yes.
Because one, you're also kind of thinking about in terms of a fixed answer.
Yes.
Fixed stone statue. I mean, this is like bringing up, like, the ideas of Narnia, where, like, there's all at the end of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, all the statues.
That's right.
And really, like, it's like, no, they're actually human. They need to be able to move. They need to be able to move through time, space, seasons,
Yes.
answers, question. They need to live the question in the
Yes.
Rilke sense that Javier will also
Yes.
talk about. And I think that it's so fascinating, because it's like, ironically, when you give up the stone, right, of like what of the answer, you actually get to, like, you actually do get to live the answer. You actually get more in touch with the answer, and that answer is the life itself, in a sense.
Well, yes, and a language I like to use, we're talking about becoming versus being. I like the language of art form, thinking of oneself as an art form, like an
Sorry,
art.
I may have said live the answer. It's really live the question.
Oh, yeah, that's good. The question is the answer, Michelle.
Yeah.
So it all
There
goes
you
together.
go. Boom.
So there's something about an art form, where there's an art form to life, where you see, because then that's kind of a dialectical, because like you're saying, there is an isness already. Like, you're a body, you're a part, there are givens. And you also, too, there's something to be said about having certain, say, rules of thumb, principles, although that's a tricky term because we have a paper on that. There are certain principles where you say, I value art. So there are things that constitute your definition, but that's not your focus. And really, it's more like you have certain premises or principles or guides to assist the becoming, to guide the becoming. So you get a dialectical relationship there between being and becoming. I always think it's interesting that becoming has be, and it's like be hyphen coming, like the coming of being. But it's always coming. Being always has to be coming to you, or it becomes an effacement. So likewise, when we think of ourselves as art forms, so form, you have Plato there, but arts, there's an art form. There's an art to this. There's an art to being a form.
I'm glad you did. I brought that. I'm glad you brought up art, because as you were talking about the poem, and there's kind of like the idea of the art of the indirectness. We talk about that.
Yes.
And that's the whole thing. It kind of seems indirect to, like, leave behind an answer in
Yes.
this movement away from the stone,
Yes.
if you
Yes.
said imagery again. But actually, it's in that indirectness that allows you to, be more fully alive and more fully, in touch with reality and
Oh, yes.
in terms of thinking and perceiving and
Well, in
all
another
that.
way, like, it's the first thing. It's always the Lewis first things first. Like, if you put apprehension first, then you can get identity as well. But if you put identity first, you lose both. Like, if you put first your cultivation of your ability to receive life over, this focus on who am I, well, then you can get both. But if you focus on this constant, like, who am I, what's the meaning of my life, and like trying to establish isness, then you don't get either. You can get a kind of isness if you've put apprehension first. Because that is a notepad. There is a kind of isness that comes with the apprehension, but it's not reducible to the isness. That's the key. You can't say that the apprehension is just a reflection on being. No, the apprehension in of itself is a rich metaphysical act that deserves prominence in the line of thought. Yeah, because it makes me think, I guess, as well, like that. It's kind of like the story of Lot's wife, where it's like, as long as you just don't look over your shoulder, then she turns to salt. It's like likewise with your identity. As long as you don't look at your identity, you'll have it. But the moment you start looking for isness, you lose it. Because isness is something you live through. The moment you look at it, it kind of goes away.
It's kind of like the sun.
Yeah. The sun, and I think
if you
also
look right at it, it's like it's kind of blinding, right?
Oh, yes.
If you look around, you can see everything by it.
I mean, following that, it's interesting because you could almost say that the problem with identity and being is that it's too bright. We're not kind of, in a sense, what we're saying is it has to be the thing that you see everything according to. You can't look at it direct. It has to be what you use for apprehension, but you can't apprehend it itself. It's like using that sun image. It's like the sun is necessary for seeing, but you can't look at the sun itself. If you do, it blinds you. Likewise, your isness, your identity, your being has to be the thing that you apprehend with, but if you try to apprehend it itself, it goes away. It's almost like then...
Yep.
Like when a video camera turns toward the screen that is projecting on, you have that infinite Hall effect, like between two mirrors. You get like an eternal regression. So the isness and identity have to be things that you apprehend with, but if you try to apprehend them themselves as opposed to just develop them and condition them and trust, there's a sense in which you just want to trust that you have them and believe that you have them. Whereas if you turn the camera to apprehend them, you get an eternal regression. They go away. They vanish, and then you have a meaning crisis. So that's part of the problem. By not having a metaphysics of apprehension, then what we end up doing is apprehending isness, and that deconstructs it. It's funny because then it's like you end up doing exactly what Derrida said, precisely because it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, in a sense.
Yeah.
So it's really important to have a metaphysics of apprehension so that you know not to use your apprehension on isness, turning the camera on the screen of itself and causing an eternal regression. And the metaphysics of apprehension is also useful, I think, because if you don't know about the metaphysics of apprehension, well, then, you spend all your time with the metaphysics of isness because you don't know there's an alternative. And so you spend all your time on a metaphysics of isness because you think that's the only thing there. So you spend all your time engaging in the deconstructive act. But if you knew there was a metaphysics of apprehension and then the corresponding art form, you would focus on that, and then you would get both. So I think realizing there's an entire metaphysics of apprehension, that we'll talk about conditionalism, aesthetic epistemology, all these different things, that opens an entire alternative of things to think about, which would then give you an alternative from trying to apprehend isness, which just causes deconstruction, which just causes eternal regressions.
Right. Well, and this is interesting, and I think this is an important thing to really add, is that basically that eternal regression that you're talking about is what happens, like you're saying, when you actually kind of, try to look directly at being or whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's something interesting because it's almost like Derrida didn't go far enough, right? He didn't deconstruct far enough, because it's almost like interestingly, what he's pointing out would actually be an eternal deconstruction, in a sense.
Oh, sure.
Because let me say this. It's almost like it's there's a way in which, because I asked you this question, remember, I was like, what does it mean to deconstruct a gap?
Oh, sure.
Because the paper will talk about the gap and all that, right, like that there. And it's like there's something kind of, to me, interesting, because even that idea is like, well, okay, so the gap is just there, and that means that it's negated, but it's almost like that there's like this eternal difference, right? That there's there's kind of something that's like forever about that, like that just keeps going on and on and on and on and on, right? And so it's almost like, yeah, he's right, he deconstructed it, but that's never a finished thing. It's a constant deconstruction.
Oh, sure. Well, because it endlessly differs, the difference.
Yes,
you can never cross the gap because there's always another term.
Right. But it's almost like, it's funny to me to think of that as like done somehow, or like defeat, like it's like that's been overcome, because it's almost like, no, that's actually just it's almost like, interestingly enough, that's kind of a type of continuation or something like that.
Well, the point is, that's why I think like Kevin Hart, Dr. Hart associates Derrida with Gödel, where the essential incompleteness. So there's an idea that what Derrida does is leave you with an unclosable gap. But if the gap is unclosable, what's deconstructed, in a sense, is the possibility of progress. You can never progress across the gap. So that's what deconstructed. But it's funny because the deconstruction accomplishes this by opening a space that you can never close, right? So there is something strange about that. It's like Derrida, in the same way, Gödel ends the effort for a fully formalized, fully justified axiomatic mathematical system by basically creating a eternal hole, an eternal gap that you can never cross.
Right. Well, I guess it's like also just a disposition of like, it's kind of like this idea of, I know there is some beautiful, mountain structure in the West or whatever, and it's like, well, we know it's there, but we're very far away, so, and we'll never really, even if we got there, we couldn't really fully experience it or like be it or something. So it must not exist.
Right.
Or like, or we must not even try. There's something kind of interesting to me to think that somehow, like what Derrida did was kind of used to justify no longer trying, in a sense.
Well, it's
with
another
metaphysics.
Well,
you know what I mean? Because it has kind of led to like, we don't need to talk about metaphysics anymore. That's
well, what Derrida did,
maybe in academic settings, I don't know.
Oh, sure. No, definitely in academic settings. I mean, Well, what can be said is what Derrida did, if we follow his line of thought, is basically in the possibility of metaphysics that doesn't become theological.
Yeah,
Because
true.
basically what you're saying is, well, how do you know that there's no something across the gap? It's like, well, you can't reach it by reason, but, you could use revelation. So certainly, and that's why people like Dr. Hart or Smith who do theology will not, it's kind of funny. A lot of religious people hate deconstruction and Derrida and different things, but a lot of thinkers like Caputo would be another example understand that Derrida actually, in a sense, is very theologically important, because if you can't cross the gap, well then that means you can't get rid of religion. Actually, funny enough, because you can't cross the gap to destroy it. So there's a way in which Derrida, from another angle, can be seen as actually good for theology, but you could also say that he creates an inseparable divide between reason and revelation, and then you get to all of those classical theological problems on how you arrive to revelation reasonably and so on and so forth. But no, I mean, to what you said on Derrida not deconstructing far enough, I mean, the idea of on typography is, if you have a bunch of scrambled letters, TAC, and then you look and it's ATC, and then it's CTA, and then it's CAT, cat. Boom. Like the letters get arranged and you see cat. Yeah. And the idea is that Derrida says, well, you can never get from the word cat to the phenomenon of cat. There's an uncrossable gap. And that's fair enough. But you still read the word cat. And you have to explain the weird moment where letters can be rearranged on a sheet of paper and suddenly it's cat. Where really, if he would have kept, so he deconstructed words, but he didn't go to letters. He didn't push his effort to letters. Wow, that's hard to say. If he pushed his effort to letters, that actually unveils the impossibility of deconstruction to deconstruct apprehension. And therefore, deconstruction is, in a sense, deconstructed. Now, we can't, again, I think Derrida is very important. And we can't say, deconstruction is perhaps deconstructed at the level of letters, therefore it's useless. Well, no, that doesn't follow. Mm-hmm. Only God can do everything, right? Even if there's some shortcomings of deconstruction, that doesn't mean it's erroneous. Because really, if indeed deconstruction takes out Platonic metaphysics, then it can be seen as a force of focus, as a force that actually makes us focus and prioritize Aristotelian metaphysics. And in that way, there is a constructive element of deconstruction. Deconstruction for Derrida is always supposed to be in service of construction. Yeah. And I think he would, he would even smile at the idea that deconstruction deconstructs itself precisely at the point where it announces a new construction on terms of Aristotelian metaphysics.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's so wonderful. Yeah, I love that, Daniel. That was so good. Well, thank you guys for joining us, and you can find this paper on Substack, Medium.
Yep. YouTube, I guess.
Yeah, YouTube.
Summary or something.
Instagram.
Anchor.
Twitter.
None of these things of which will cross the gap of our experience, but hopefully we'll point to them.
You will be able to apprehend them.
Yeah, and even if you can't cross the gap, they still may exist. We still may be here, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.